Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. So finally, one of the big seroprevalence studies have been published, and we've learned, I think, some really interesting things. So these seroprevalence studies are basically, they take people's blood and they evaluate them for antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, which means that they've been infected with the virus and the body has developed antibodies. And so they do this over very large percentage of the population, and they can come out with some pretty good numbers of how many people have been infected. So it certainly varies from state to state, but overall, pretty much the majority of Americans have been infected and have antibodies, so they have natural immunity. If you overlay the seroprevalence studies with actually a pretty cool sort of collaborative collection tool called covidestim.org, covidestim.org. It's a collaborative effort through Stanford, Harvard, and Yale, and it's a really kind of real-time collection of a whole bunch of data. They actually put the natural infection percent of Americans closer to about 80%. So it's hard to know what it is, perfectly. We don't have, everybody in the United States tested, but they take, a huge percentage of the population and come up with these general statistics and averages. And so the truth is probably somewhere in between, but it seems to be that certainly the vast majority of Americans have been infected by SARS-CoV-2, and so they have natural immunity. And even the CDC had to admit that natural immunity is 3 to 5 times more effective against future infections compared to vaccine-induced immunity. So that was something very interesting to learn. So what we've learned is that we have herd immunity basically to a virus, to a disease that only has a case fatality rate of about 0.3%. And they're still talking about making mandates. I'll come back to that in just a moment. The other interesting to know that have come out from this covidestim.org collection of data is that the reproduction rate of the virus, it's called the R naught. Oftentimes it'll be written as R0. So the R naught, or the reproduction sort of factor of SARS-CoV-2 currently is less than 1. At a height of the reproductive factor, it was, I think, as high as 7, which means that each person who's infected with SARS-CoV-2, depending on what the variant is, they can pass it on to 7 other people. So obviously that's a very, very high infection rate. And so now the R naught is less than 1, which means that if a person gets infected, it's unlikely that they're even going to pass it on or cause another person to get infected. And there's probably lots of reasons for that, but certainly one of them is the other statistic that we mentioned, that the vast majority of Americans have natural immunity. And so their chance of getting it again are dramatically reduced. So those two key things together, the R naught being less than 1. In other words, it's unlikely that you're going to pass it on to one person if you get infected. So that really indicates that the virus is by and large really petering out over time, which is, that's a pandemic ending R naught. That coupled with the fact that the majority of Americans have natural immunity, and again, like the CDC even had to admit, that leaves a immunity that's 3 to 5 times better even than vaccine-induced immunity. So that's interesting. Here's another thing that I think is even more interesting is that when they looked at kids in this most recent seroprevalence study, they found that the vast majority of kids, is almost 60%, and some would argue that even that number is probably too low, have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So they have protective antibodies, and there are still districts that have just voted recently to mandate the COVID vaccine for the 2022-2023 school year. So the R naught is less than 1. The vast majority of Americans have been infected and have natural immunity, which is 3 to 5 times better than vaccines. And school districts like one in San Diego, the San Diego Unified School District, recently voted to mandate vaccines for the coming school year. Does that make sense to anybody? It doesn't make sense to me. So kids who are, the least affected, what we've understand very clearly during the COVID era is that it's a very risk stratified condition. In other words, depending on your age, could really speak to the potential of severity of getting COVID and that outcome being severe. Obviously, the older population have a much, much higher percentage of a severe COVID outcome, but kids, we know by far, have the least severe outcome. The majority of them have natural immunity, so they've already developed antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. The R naught is less than 1, so the chances of one person passing on to another is extremely low. And they have the least effect if they happen to get COVID or infected with SARS-CoV-2. So you put all that information together and mandating for the coming year to be vaccinated, I don't see how this makes sense really to anybody. And if you take all that information and you overlay it with an article that was written in the New York Times way back, this is old information from like 3 weeks ago. What we learned is that the CDC is withholding vaccine data. So in my opinion, finally the New York Times, kind of got something right by kind of not being a talking piece for the sort of narrative. They wrote an article that was really well done, I think, and they talked about why the CDC is withholding this data. Now, if you just think logically, because this is logical stuff, if the data clearly indicated how well the vaccine was working, do you think that they would withhold that? I don't think so. So it really makes you wonder, what is the data that they're withholding? They even go on to say, we feel that if the data was released, that it would be misrepresented. This is what their own people are saying, that the data would be misrepresented. Clearly, it's showing something that they don't want us to see. And that's a big problem. It's such a problem that one of the biggest vaccine advocates that I know of, his name is Paul Offit. He's a vaccine researcher, vaccine developer. He is a vaccine advisor to the FDA. He is the most pro-vaccine person that I know of. He actually said to the CDC regarding this information that is being withheld, and this is quoted in the New York Times article, he said, "Tell the truth, present the data." That's the exact quote. He went on to say more, which is also quoted in the New York Times. But tell the truth and present the data. This is like the number one vaccine advocate. And I also say about Offit is that he wrote about this, I think, in the Atlantic, that he's got a 20-year-old son. And he really called into question the necessity and efficacy of his son getting the booster. He already had the first 2 shots of the mRNA vaccine, and he actually suggested to his son to not get the booster. Not get the booster. The data just do not show that that would be necessary and healthy and safe. So this is all very interesting. There's so much information out there that it's changing so quickly. That's why I said way back 3 weeks ago, way back in time, that this information was coming out. So the Sarah Prevalence study is very interesting, and when you couple that with the withholding vaccine data from the CDC, there's so many red flags that you really got to keep asking the questions. Ask the questions of your kids' teachers, ask the questions to the school leaders and to the district. It just doesn't make sense. You put all this into, a big soup, and it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever to mandate the vaccine for kids. And even, and that is not to say mandating the vaccine for adults, but it just seems like such an egregious overreach and who knows whatever superlatives I can throw in there. But it just doesn't make sense whatsoever given the data. And again, real quick, the vast majority of kids have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and they have antibodies, natural immunity, which the CDC admits is 3 to 5 times better, more effective for preventing a future case than a vaccine-induced immunity. The R naught, meaning how much the virus is going to spread to other people, is less than 1. That means if you get infected, the chance, there's a low chance, less than, you will spread it to less than 1 person. And the fact that the CDC is withholding information that could be very important in the school district's decision-making process as to whether this should even be mandated. And it's highly, highly likely to be negative information against the vaccines. So I'll keep reading the studies and bringing you the information. Until then, keep it real.